The history books tell us that Waterloo defeated Napoleon once and for all and ushered in the great European peace. But history is never that neat. In fact, there were 3 weeks of uncertainty, skirmishes, and maneuvering between Napoleon's dreams being crushed between the hammer of the Prussians and the anvil of Wellington's coalition forces, and the Quadruple Alliance placing Louis XVIII back on the throne of France. Tonight, I sit down with Corporal Liam Telfer of the 44th East Essex and Dr. Zack White to explore a living history event dedicated to the uncertainty of that month, and in the process explore how lived events will seem very different to different people. This is the Battle of Laboisiere Ecole, the Allied invasion of France through 2 sets of eyes and 2 sets of cameras. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars podcast. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars podcast, where we have a treat for you. The last weekend in August 2025, Boissiere Ecole took place. Billed as Europe's premium immersive Napoleonic campaign tactical event, say that 3 times fast while drunk, the multi-day event takes participants back to July 1815, where, in the aftermath of Waterloo, the 7th Coalition advanced into France. This year, the Napoleonic Wars podcast, which was a headline sponsor of the event, had 2 representatives on the ground. Liam Telfer, in his role as Corporal of the 2nd Battalion, 44th East Essex Regiment of Foot, and Zack White as, quote, pretend I'm not here, but please don't ride me over with this horse, end quote, videographer historian. This evening, I gather them to discuss the event and their takeaways. And for possibly the first time ever on the history of this podcast, Zack does not know what questions are going to be asked. How does that make you feel, Zack?
Well, how bad can it be? He says, immediately thinking of what happened when Bonaparte dispatched Murat to Spain. I mean, it can't be a cock-up of that proportion, surely. So we'll be fine, probably. It's worth saying, though, there's a reason why you haven't given me the questions, because we're conducting a sort of social experiment, by which I don't mean the podcast is a social experiment. I mean, people can regard this as a petri dish.
Absolutely. No, but we are. We're going to be looking a little bit at oral history and memory here, for which I have no qualifications whatsoever to interview or intervene. Corporal Telfer, fresh from a new office, looking very sharp, my friend.
Yeah, it is the first recording that I am joining you all from what I'm calling the cabin. It is not the shed. It's now called the cabin. I've gone like full Master and Commander sort of Royal Navy style. So I mean, there's a victory over my shoulder. Really excited, and I think it is going to be really interesting to not have prepared for this interview. Not because we're obviously hyper committed and not that we're lazy or anything, but they're really interesting to look at that impact of memory and how things have changed in the intervening period, which I know is something that we talk about quite a lot with primary sources in mind.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we're going to start with something a little odd here today. I want to start with a little exercise in oral history. Zack is going to sod off. He's going to unplug his headphones and go and paint a miniature for a few minutes, while Liam recounts the skirmish he was part of on the final morning of Boissiere Ecole. Then, after Liam has recounted his experiences, Zack will return and do the same. Liam, take it away.
Wow, no pressure. So we had advanced out of our bivouac. I don't know what time it was. I'm not going to sort of try and stick to timings with this, not having a watch, being in the early 19th century. And we had sort of tried to find and fix the French pretty much for the last 24 hours. Anyway, so we were moving along a track. We held firm for a little bit because our cavalry, our light cavalry, our friends from the Dutch, some light Dutch light cavalry regiment had located the French, and we came across some French spread out in a skirmish line. Don't know if they were light troops, but they were definitely spread out in a wood block. We pursued them into a wood block. they sort of firing and retiring, and us advancing in a skirmish line, and pushed them like to our forwards and to our right. Again, I couldn't tell you which direction that was, not having a compass. At which point we came upon what I think was probably a main body of such. And had a bit of a skirmish at a crossroads with a bit of hand-to-hand fighting. At which point we were clearly outnumbered, and started to retire out of these woods and through down this quite a steep slope, quite a narrow sort of roadway, winding its way through these woods. And it was a case of just firing and retiring. And we had a contingent of Nassau and some 7th Belgian Line that was sort of sometimes behind us, sometimes ahead of us. We sort of pepper potted back to the point where we cleared the wood block and headed into a village. And that was it, really. It was confusing. It was loud, lots of movement, lots going on. I think it's a great demonstration of battle in the period. Your sort of world is very small. You're moving, reloading, firing, and retiring for us, because of the scenario, and also because of the numbers game. You can't necessarily take on forces bigger than yourself, because it's kind of a war game type situation, these tactical events. So that's a sort of a pretty brief run through of how it went down.
That's perfect. Thank you, Liam. And I just want to really, right before we bring Zack in, because I think this is going to be worth noting right away. When we read these accounts, even the ones that are written like the day after and all that, we don't think twice about we met the enemy at 7 o'clock or we pushed in an easterly direction. But in a lot of cases, that would have been filled in later, right? That would have been filled in, especially for accounts like letters from line soldiers. A lieutenant or a captain may have had a time to look at his pocket watch and figure, okay, it's 5 p.m. But for a lot, it's going to be based on general history and sort of what's going on, or they've seen a map and it's gone from there. So again, even that sort of eyewitness is always going to be filtered a little bit. Okay, Zack, I want you to recount as a witness, but not a participant, the skirmish that you witnessed involving the 44th on the morning of the final day of Boissiere Ecole.
Okay, so full disclaimer, people, we've set this up as a social experiment, and apologies, but because I do a lot of editing stuff on this show, my memory has definitely changed on this, because I've not only reviewed some of the video footage, I've very deliberately sort of left it for about a fortnight, but I have seen the footage, and I've also seen footage of other people who have done filming for this event, which actually completely changes my understanding of some of the things that I know happened. But broadly speaking, my memory is that Captain Mark Middleton, who had overall command of the Allied contingent, had fundamentally sort of 3, I'm not sure I can even call them platoons, but we'll go with platoons because I haven't got a better word for them. Liam will doubtlessly be sort of sitting there with itchy teeth at my lack of adequate terminology, but we can't call them sections either, because Liam was commanding sections at various points, I'm sure. And those platoons consisted of a Dutch-Belgian contingent, a British/Austrian contingent, and then some Garde Nationale, plus a few skirmishers and 2 guys on horseback. His technical terms, obviously, one was a lancer, like the other guy had a sword. The guy with the sword nearly took my eye out at one point. Like that was squeaky bum time, but that's a story for another day.
Things are dangerous in war, Zack. Ooh.
Surely not.
Shocking. How very dare he?
Cavalrymen waving their sabers around. This will never catch on.
Sure. I love the idea of a war game where the only casualty is a historian.
Well, it would certainly turn the tables for once, wouldn't it? Essentially, what I particularly remember vividly is Mark saying, I'm not going to maneuver today. I'm just going to go straight at them. And he became aware of the presence of the French force being up a very heavily wooded hill. And at the point at which they made contact, the French were at the edge of this wood. It was a kind of slightly weird concoction in that the road went through a wooded area, then went through a section where there was lots of open ground to the right, and then a lot of heavily, very, very thick wood, both on the left of the road and where the hill proper kind of started. All technical terminology here. And I very quickly became used to the idea that these things start in a pretty pell-mell fashion. You know, there isn't a point at which everybody goes, okay, here we go. The Dutch-Belgian contingent, I think, was the first to make contact. I think the Garde Nationale was in reserve. And I was doing some filming of the Dutch-Belgians, sort of trying to get into a decent position for them, looked over my shoulder and then completely dropped the Dutch-Belgians because Liam's contingent was out in skirmish order. And from that point on, I just followed them. Didn't end up being the best call initially from a cinematography point of view, because they were sent to try and clear this heavily wooded section of the hill. And it was basically single file. Like, there was a lot of shooting going on somewhere else. And I was at the back, because obviously you don't stick yourself in the middle of the unit because that's a jerk move. Like, these guys are here to, you know, get immersed in their impression, and some prat in a tricorn hat running around waving cameras in their face is not conducive to that. So I'm at the back of this, behind some Austrian chaps who were probably flagging at this point. Bear in mind, they've done sort of 2.5 days of campaign life. And because it's single file, and we're talking thick brambles either side, like you can't force your way through, I'm there kind of going, come on, chaps, like, I want to get closer to the action. Can we sort of speed this up? But just shutting the hell up. So I don't really know what happened in the first 10 minutes. What I do eventually recall happening is somebody at some point, probably David Preece, who was the sergeant and overall commander of the 44th, and therefore this platoon, must have made a call that they were going to head back to the road because they just weren't making any headway through this wood. And by the time I'd got through behind the Austrians, they were formed up, gave a volley, and then charged. And I barely kind of got there in time. So I didn't get the chance to sort of assess the situation. Then I sort of look over my shoulder, see that there was a bunch of cavalry bods about to bear down. Then also see some cavalry on the opposite side of the road, because we've kind of reached a clearing at this point. Then some French guys charge with the bayonet. They completely sandwich Liam's platoon. And beyond that, I can't really recall what fills the gap. I know that I then filmed some Dutch-Belgian guys firing a volley. Somehow they then end up further to the north. They fire a volley at the French. Some of the French kind of do the, oh, I've been shot, I'm dying thing. Because by this point, some of the guys were really kind of getting into the artistic thing of it. And then the next thing I know, I look over my shoulder and the Allies are just pissing off. They've pulled back. Liam's section ends up sort of doing a rear guard. They get charged as they're sort of holding this bottleneck in a hedge that's sort of covering a path that leads down the hill. And then I just let the French sort of wash forwards, and so that I'm effectively behind the French contingent and I can film the French side of the battle. And for the next, it felt like the next 20 minutes, it was literally just a running firefight. And I really do mean running. Constantly sort of trying to get ahead of the French to film what ended up being the Dutch-Belgians. I don't know how this happened, but the Dutch-Belgians seemed to hold the rear guard, and Liam's contingent, I got no clue where they went. They just seemed to disappear. I didn't see Liam until the rest of the battle was over. And so there's this sort of running firefight between these guys, and the Dutch-Belgians got zero chance because they are completely overwhelmed. Sheer weight of numbers. It's like 3, perhaps even 4 to 1, the disparity in numbers. The Dutch at this point are really struggling in terms of the flints, to the point where one of the things that I've got on film is where their captain, their lieutenant, a guy called Laurent, lines them up, prepares them for a volley, gives the order to fire, and they all go click. And you've just got this moment where everybody kind of looks at each other, and Laurent just goes, "Wow."
Opschouder!
Like, how did every single one of those flints fail? Which gives us a really interesting indication of wear and tear. This firefight sort of peters out as much as anything else because they can't continue to fight all the way into the town. There are certain restrictions and rules. And the last act of the day is basically a really nice little scene where a couple of guys from the Dutch contingent go and ambush a picket. They nab the guy, take him prisoner, and they use that as a dummy to then lure out some of the French. And they've split this platoon into two sections. The I think it's the 7th Dutch-Belgian line are stood there, and they make a show of sort of standing, preparing to give a volley. But they do so in such a way that they've masked the fact that over on their flank are the 27th Jaegers, who at the relevant moment, as the French emerge sort of into this cul-de-sac almost, they get hit on two sides by a volley. It's that classic kind of ambush thing. There's lots of laughing and jeering on both sides, and then everybody marches into the town. That's not exactly a very exciting, very dynamic run through, which kind of emphasizes this idea that I haven't prepped this. But hopefully it shows how utterly bafflingly confusing the whole thing is.
Yeah, no, it does. And it also is a wonderful, wonderfully different focus and narration than Liam's. Not in a way that anyone will listen to this and go, well, one of them is lying, but very much hammers home, the different priorities, the different experiences. Zack, first of all, intuitively taking a historian's view, and very much a director of photography view as well, right? But also, his job is to look over the whole thing. He doesn't. It doesn't matter if he gets overrun by the French, because he just gets better footage. Whereas for Liam, it's a very different kettle of fish. But I think that's a really interesting little exercise. And when I read both of your reports, including Liam's wonderful in character report, which I thoroughly enjoyed, that was what stuck out to me, and that's sort of what the moment I wanted to pick up on. Okay. So other portions of this interview are going to be pretty standard, but I did want to start with that sort of little play, basically. All three of us have studied this period for years, probably to the sacrifice of our social lives, with the exception of Liam. But I want to talk to you about what's seeing this event hammered home to you.
So from my perspective, the first thing is how kinetic everything is. We talk so much about, lines of redcoats standing firm or guys sort of marching over a muddy field, and everything sort of feels very ponderous and sort of very regimented. And granted, what I observed were three skirmishes, in fact, over the course of the 2.5 days. But everything is so kinetic, that sense of fixing and flanking being a constant search. And the French commander was incredible at this, always making sure that he had a reserve in hand to be able to sort of send somebody to that flank or send somebody to that flank. I think also the thing that particularly struck me in the afternoon of the second day, when the British are trying to sort of push their way into this little village, is that everybody's dead. And that sounds like a really sort of banal thing to say about combat, but when it's your mates that you're observing in this firing line, as somebody who's just a passive observer, knowing that no bullets are flying, but you're looking at this, particularly the route that they had to take in was this really quite narrow lane, wall on one side, sort of fences and things on another side. There was nowhere for them to go. There wasn't any maneuver that they could do. They just had to push on through. And you look at the volleys that are coming the other way, and you look at it and go, yeah, no, Liam's dead. Liam is absolutely dead. David is dead. Other people that I know from that unit, they're all dead. And I think for all that we talk a lot about the survivors and their accounts, because we have to, I think it sort of when you actually stop and see what that weight of fire from even a single platoon looks like in a confined space, that's the point at which you start to realize just how bloody and brutal this conflict should be. And I know folks will be listening to this thinking, well, he's high. Like, everybody knows this conflict is brutal. Seeing it is something else to actually sort of thinking, okay, so many thousand die in this kind of a space. Those are the big things. Obviously, from my perspective, actually witnessing what this looks like in practice in terms of drill, in terms of sights and sounds and all the rest of it was just electric. But I think the single strongest thing for me was just the impact of weight of numbers. Numbers do matter. If a guy wielding a musket is sent into the field, he can do some damage. And if you're too far on the back foot in terms of weight of numbers, my sense as somebody who is not trained in the art of war is that there's relatively little in terms of options that you've got to combat that. Because, you know, if somebody's coming in on your flank and they are able to fire in a reasonable fashion, what do you do against that? I don't know.
All right. Thank you for that, Zach. Liam, same question, but obviously not limited to just this event, right? You've got a broader spectrum here. So what do you see as the most important takeaways from your living history work?
I think it's just that. I think it's the living history element. I think it's quite easy to find either spaces or venues, whether it be in the UK or abroad, where you can do sort of small displays and you can like lay kit out and you can do talks and you can really engage the public in that sense, which is obviously really important. And you can show certain elements of, you know, you can do a musket volley even, when we do quite often have sort of skirmishes at living history events in the UK, with the other units at events with the Napoleonic Association. But particularly with an event like Laboisiere Ecole in mind, that is where you get to do, I guess, Napoleonic fieldcraft. You are existing in the field in a campaign setting, and you're living off what you can carry. You know, there's no sort of end of the day, the public leaves, the sort of, you know, someone brings out a modern coat, or, you know, you bring out the modern snacks or anything like that. It really is. I think that's the biggest takeaway I have is I can now exist as an early 19th century, not just an early 19th century soldier for that matter, but I can exist in a space where I can be as close to the early 19th century as possible. You know, I'm having to cook food in the period way. I'm having to maintain, repair, and look after my equipment in a period way. I'm having to have a shelter and exist like these people did, like these men and women did during the campaign. And I think that's the biggest thing that LBE allows us to do as living historians, is to live in history, you know, and really get to grips with how the kit itself copes in that setting where you're not just wearing it for an hour for a display or for a short skirmish. You are carrying it because you need it, and you're having to exist with that. And there's no backup, there's no support, there's no easy out, you know. And I mean, obviously, for events like LBE, there are huge amounts go into the health and safety aspect of things. You know, there are measures in place, but they are very much behind the scenes, and you know, they don't feel like they're sort of impacting, you know, the experience as such. And just again, little things like living with soldiers. You know, as Zach said earlier, I was sort of commanding a section. You know, when we halt, I'm sending out guys for pickets. It's not just, right, chill out, guys, sit on your packs. You know, there is an enemy out there. There is an active role to be played at all times. At one point, we'd taken a small objective, which was a sort of cluster of farm buildings around a crossroads. And the wagon hadn't come up. Now, the wagon was our kind of health and safety backup, and it had water on board. But, you know, everyone was out of water and the wagon hadn't come up because the roads are difficult. And I mean, it's a great example of what happened during the period. So we're basically looking around in these farm buildings for a tap or for something in order for guys to fill canteens. And you just don't get that at these sort of closed, sort of quite sanitary, quite safe events elsewhere. So yeah, I think that the biggest takeaway is being able to exist in that zone and really kind of get your head into what these people went through, which is, I feel really lucky to be able to do. And I would urge anyone who does any form of living history or any period, not just Napoleonics, to try and find a way of really reaching out and engaging in the past that way.
One thing that, just to add to what Liam's saying, one thing that you're not conscious of in the moment, but I certainly began to appreciate looking back on the footage, is the wear on the kit and what that actually looks like. What's the difference between parade dress, which is what you're likely but not always going to see at a living history event, where people have, they've cleaned their kit, they've done all the appropriate things before they arrive, and then actually within 48 hours on campaign, these guys have got patination on their muskets. The colors are starting to run on certain things, and so I've got some lovely shots of people just looking a bit muddy and a bit kind of browbeaten and weather worn. And I think, again, because we don't have the real visual element and we're constantly looking for a sort of surrogate for that, actually an immersive event like this is on a completely different level to anything you will ever see, because these guys have just had to spend 48 hours making this stuff work. And so, buttons are falling off kit and things look messy. And in terms of our unending search for authenticity, this is why it was such a pleasure to support an event like this, because actually for us to be able to come in and look at what that looks like is unparalleled. There is no, replicating that.
Some 10-year-old is going to find a button that fell off Liam's kit and for the rest of his life be convinced it's from the 44th, from the actual Waterloo campaign. I'm actually going to jump back. Go ahead, Zach, please.
You say that. We have a question mark about a coin that was found in one of the fields. I'll add the relevant visuals because I took a photo of the guy who found it. One of the Garde Nationale guys finds a French coin, and we've got no idea if it's authentic or not, whether it's lots of jokes being made about, oh yeah, I dropped that round here last year, I'll have it back now, kind of thing, that people inevitably do in a scenario like that. But it happens, right? And this is one of the things that I think Tony Pollard has talked about. When you go and scan a battlefield now, if, like Waterloo, you've had reenactments take place over it, you're going to find a surface layer of just reenactment stuff that then conflicts with the actual archaeological evidence. And you need a lab to sort of start to work out, in many cases, is this actually 20 years old or is this 200 years old?
Amazing. And of course, as I've repeatedly said on this podcast and elsewhere, there's an entire history of reproductions that is actually now part of the history because it was being made in the 1820s and 30s, usually for a British audience, usually in British factories. I'm actually going to jump ahead because this ties into what Liam was saying. This event ends with a slap-up lunch of bread, pate, and fresh fruit provided by local residents. But in general, LBE is by design a very different type of event from a lot of the living history events that our listeners may be familiar with or may even have participated in on either side of the rope. Let's put it that way. So tell me about your experiences with quote-unquote civilians in both meanings of the term during the event and in general, how they respond to this.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting point in terms of local populace, French civilians going about their day, in some of the villages we passed through. I think in a way it's probably quite similar to some civilians during the period. They're sort of being like, what's going on here? Like, why are there soldiers marching through my village? And my French is I'm being generous when I say it's minimal. If I give it the old, avez-vous regardé le soldat français and all that sort of caper, they just look at you as if you're an alien. And I kind of get that vibe. I think, we know from primary source accounts of the period that soldiers weren't always well received. They weren't necessarily negatively received either. It was just a bit like, oh, I'm not really sure about this. And I guess the proof would always be in the pudding, like, are these guys here to pay for things? Are these guys here to ransack? Or are they going to quite happily sleep in my barn and pay for everything and then move on? And I think that's the sort of the feeling I get from the feeling I got from the French civilians. We were encouraged as participants to engage with them and sort of, again, ask for water, ask for any intelligence they might have, or indeed any sort of food that they might share with us. And I suppose it's a difficult balance because, again, we don't, none of us really spoke French. That certainly within my section, and it's that sort of how do I imitate a tap in a canteen with hand signals to a point where they might understand? You just get a lot of blank looks. But on the flip side of that, it's obviously well supported locally because, like you say, on the last day there, once we sort of called Index, the village turned out and provided us with some bread and some pate and some cider and sort of fresh fruit and stuff, which was lovely. And also at the Allied, certainly where the Allied bivouac was on the Saturday night, the sort of end of the first full day, as it were, there was a bit of a sort of almost a bit of a fete at the local church where they brought out. It was a bit of a juxtaposition because we're all trying, and I'm sort of beasting my guys to sort of stay immersive, stay in the zone, and then all of a sudden we're being invited to have sort of drinks and nibbles with the local population, which we would never say no to. But at the same time, it was sort of slightly odd, especially when there's a lot of French reenactors there as well, who were obviously invited. And I mean, fair play to the local community for supporting us, and it was much appreciated. It does obviously affect the kind of immersive element of it, but I mean, ultimately, how I think you can only take the immersion so far, right? Like, we're all modern people. We live in the modern age. There's cars driving past, there's pylons, there's aircraft, there's you'll never be able to fully feel what a early 19th century person felt. But they were really keen, really supportive. You get a bit of jibing between ourselves and the guys with French impressions and with the civilians as well. It's sort of some of the jokes about, like lock up your daughters and all that sort of cape, playing the red coat a little bit and sort of a few of the sort of the sharpisms creep out, I think, from some people. But no, generally, I think they're really supportive, and I guess it's good for the area. It's good to bring this history to life, and they know that too, So to sort of feel hosted in that sense was brilliant.
Zach, anything from the civilian point of view in a weird way?
Yeah, so firstly, just Liam's on the nose with everything. There's a lot of local interest in this. Because I'm there kind of very obviously filming stuff, they all sort of either assume that I have a higher level of knowledge of what the heck is going on, or they'll assume that I'm somehow cultured and therefore speak French better than Liam, which regrettably, and to my enduring shame, is not the case. But yeah, a few times locals kind of stopped me and said, this is really interesting. Bear in mind, like, my translation skills are not good, but this is really interesting, like what's going on. And so you sort of have this conversation in broken French about what they're doing. As soon as there's a battle, people turning up with smartphones. Somebody pitched up with a drone, which was a decidedly buttock clenching moment, because if you've got two drones in one bit of airspace, like, that's a moment where you need to be careful. Fortunately, I hadn't deployed Scoville at that moment in time. But I was like, well, clearly I'm not going to be deploying Scoville now, because that's going to be a problem. So yeah, the other thing to say is that this doesn't happen, I don't think, if there isn't some willingness from the local community to accommodate this. Like, you've got a bunch of guys running around with muskets, having a go at a scale model of war. And that means a lot of flashes and bangs in certain places. That's local disruption in these very sleepy, very pretty villages in the French countryside. And then they turn out and they get involved and they want to have a chat. The other big filming presence at this event was Pierre from Capsule de l'Histoire. And he made a point during this sort of, as Liam describes it, during this fete, of showing his film that he shot last time he was at LBE to the locals, and it's all in French. And there was a huge amount of interest. This thing plays on repeat, and these folks are sort of sitting down, genuinely interested in what's going on. They've got pictures up from the last the last immersive event. So there's a lot of interest from the local community, and they're not necessarily getting big amounts of money. I mean, sure, some idiot like me turns up and finds a local lodge and kips there for a couple of nights. That's not really benefiting the local economy much. So I think there is this sort of genuine interest and willingness from the locals to just kind of support an event like this, which is really welcome, because if Liam and I have had conversations about could an equivalent be done in the UK, and the big challenge is how do you find the space and find that space where the locals aren't going to object to you disrupting their sleepy, rural idyll.
Always tricky. Yeah, no, that is really, really interesting. Again, something that both of you mentioned and really just feeds into this, right, is both of you highlight the multinational, multilingual melting pot aspects of this event. And this is a particular, look, in portions of the Grand Armée, this is just the reality. But this particular blend is sort of unique to the Seventh Coalition in certain ways. But I wanted to have you guys expand a little bit on that sort of melting pot aspect and how it feels.
I think it's a great point, and it's difficult, if I'm honest, at times. One of my sort of, we talked about the memory of that sort of final skirmish. We've got a relatively small British English speaking section, and we're trying to coordinate with French National Guard with very little English, with Austrians who I think were mostly actually Italian with very little English. And we're trying to form a cohesive body of soldiery, if you like. And it was really tricky, to try and get units to move in a way that would benefit us. So we sort of led the sort of that block in terms of command and control. So in terms of pushing, we'd try and send the National Guard, being slightly lighter troops. They would do quite a lot of our flank protection and stuff like that, but trying to engage with them rather than, jump into that wood line and push forward and then round to the right, guys, happy days, no worries, off you go. It was a pause. It was an illustrate. It was a point. So that kind of language barrier in itself is very difficult. And also thinking out of it from almost a historical point of view, but the drill manuals are very different, and trying to form that cohesive unit when everyone's doing slightly different things is very tricky. Not so much in camp or in bivouac or on the march, because, forward march, follow the guy in front. But when you're in a situation that's relatively kinetic and you need things to happen quickly, particularly when you're facing a force that not only outnumbers you, but is completely homogenous. They're all French. They all speak French. They're all working from the same manual generally. I know there's a bit of play in that, but I'm sort of, as a broad stroke, they're all working together in a much more cohesive way. It was really difficult. And I think it was one of the reasons why we kind of struggled to form sort of cohesive units. I know that the sort of Dutch Belgian contingent, the 7th Line and the Jaegers work together quite consistently on the continent anyway. So they've already built up a kind of a rapport, and they have a bit of joint unit cohesion. Whereas our block, as it were, our platoon was very disjointed, and it was really difficult to work together. And it really puts you in that mindset of, geez, what was this like during the period? Now, we're talking bigger formations during the period. That should be said. You wouldn't have the numbers that we had in such close proximity, and there would probably be more command and control in terms of liaison, right? You'd have officers running between these units with at least a modicum of common language. But it was really difficult, and it definitely made the experience probably more valuable in some ways, but also much more challenging.
And I think what we sort of downplay these days is the enormity of that difference, certainly initially during an early phase of deployment. I mean, this is an era where people are starting to become a bit more mobile, but they are nothing like as mobile or as socially aware as they will become. And things like accents end up being something that's a factor to play in. You know, sure, these particularly in the British case, you've got Irishmen, Scotsmen, and Welshmen and Englishmen all within the same unit, and so they would learn to get used to one another's accents. But actually, for a guy from Portugal hearing Liam's accent, even if he's sort of vaguely aware of some English words, he would hear Liam speaking and would probably struggle quite a bit to get used to that. So I think it requires a sort of a bit of a step back to go into the 19th century mindset to then extract that little bit more, because today we're so used to, you know, linguistics and all the rest of it. But what I also found quite striking is the words that bleed across certain languages. Swear words, for example, definitely you can tell the general gist of a certain utterance, especially if it's said with some gusto behind it. You know, there was a point where somebody put a section laid down their muskets whilst they were about to be paraded, and then the sergeant comes along and it utters some words that you get the idea of what he was saying in terms of, why are these muskets on the floor, sorry? So there's definitely some stuff that comes through like that. From my perspective, it was beautiful to see, partly because you've got different uniforms, so it's nice to sort of have those moments from a cinematography perspective, because you're always looking for the stories to tell, and that's what I'm there to do. I'm not there to capture the moment so much as the stories that I can kind of utilize further down the line. And so when you've got Prussians and Austrians and Dutch and inevitably British all together, that is fantastic. And yeah, it was interesting to see how quickly the guys got over those hurdles. You know, Liam talks about the challenges of that, but from an outsider looking at what they were doing, from my perspective, I thought they got over those hurdles quite well. And there's a lot of kind of discussion backwards and forwards about, so, you know, do we leave the muskets unloaded or do we load at this point? And section commanders kind of doing their best to sort of deal with all of those things. But yeah, in terms of the stress of it, I mean, Liam, I don't know if you felt particularly stressed, because it's not an actual firefight. It's obviously a simulation exercise. But I don't know whether that added to the stress. You know, there were moments when you really got into character. And we won't repeat some of the phrases, but like when David turns around and says, you know, number one section, I need you to increase your rate of fire. Liam offers some vocal encouragement, shall we say, to his section in terms of upping the speed, which we won't include for expletive reasons. But like, it's interesting to see that you guys managed it, and you managed it from my perspective very well. But did it actually add to the stress of the experience?
Firing when as soon as you're loaded in a section, get it firing. Good. Get the rate of fire up. You're coming on quickly. Get the rate of fire up.
Number one section. Make ready. Present. Fire. Speed up. Speed up.
I mean, you say about me being in character. Let's be honest, like that's not a character. That's just me being me, right? Like, you know, I got told by the sort of the platoon commander to take over my section's fire control orders and speed them up. Like, that's not a, yeah, there was definitely, I remember that moment. I was on the right hand side, and obviously there was some creative and constructive feedback being given. And I think that one of the reasons for that is because obviously I drill with these guys, I train with these guys in a, you know, from a non-living history aspect, we work together quite closely. And I'm proud of my red coat, and I want my guys to be proud of their red coats. Like, you know, we're not going to be firing slower than the French National Guard. Like, yeah, how very dare you? Like, yeah, like you say, there was a few choice words. And I liked, it's great that you sort of, from your perspective, you sort of feel like we got over some of those challenges. And I think it's really interesting to look at. And one of the things that I was thinking about in not really in prep for this, because I know we intentionally didn't prep for the sort of memory side of it, but you know, that kind of a little bit of mistrust between different nations, and purely from a non-living history aspect. Now, a good chunk of the French National Guardsmen that we had with us on our side, you know, long live the king and all that sort of stuff. The only reason they were on the Allied side was because the numbers were restricted in order to try and keep the sides balanced. And the French were full. So, the Imperial French were full. So these guys were basically said, look, if you want to do the event, you've got to do it as French National Guardsmen on the side of the Allies. And so we were right away, as far as we were aware, that there's a big chunk of these guys that are bivouacking with us that don't particularly want to be there and rather be on the other side. So there's that kind of, it's a really interesting kind of mindset to be like, yeah, I see. Like, how are these guys going to react to, being in combat with their friends? And I think that's almost reflective of how British soldiers during the period would have felt about, Dutch Belgians, French National Guard. And it's a really interesting, that sort of mistrust in the exercise version and also in real life. So yeah, it's really funny to sort of think about it that way.
Without question, I think that really does sort of hammer it home. Just a few notes on this from my own, thinking about this. First of all, on accents, we're still very much in the period where languages are becoming standardized. Especially you think about the Italian campaign, like Napoleon's early Italian campaigns. What we now think of as the country of Italy not only didn't exist, but the language across that peninsula was so different that you've got 6 or 7 different Italian really doesn't standardize until the advent of television, until national Italian television comes in. It really does, everything you guys are saying hammers home both on Liam's okay, which side are these guys actually on, to the how do we get everyone to parade efficiently, just hammers home how hard coalition warfare can be and how impressive it is when it works. The people that can manage it well, and I'm talking about across the board here. Whether it's Wellington and his men and his leaders, or Napoleon's marshals dealing with Polish contingents, etc., is genuinely impressive. But the thing that really jumped out at me about this, and it was something Liam said, is there's the different drills, right? Obviously the different kits we think about, but the different drills especially. And we've all read those xenophobic bits about sort of paraded alongside the Dutch Belgians who clearly don't know what they're doing. And now part of that is just pure old racism, but part of it is very probably these guys don't even know how to load a musket, and they do. It's just not the same way that they load a musket. And that's building into stereotypes, even that you don't even think about, right? And that's a really interesting, something I wouldn't have even considered without this conversation. That's sort of one of the reasons why I wanted to do this conversation, because I don't really do camping or anything like that. Okay. Leaving on a sort of practical side, sort of sticking with this a little bit, both of you mentioned the role of terrain. Now, our veteran listeners will be rolling their eyes and saying, yes, of course terrain matters, and we all know terrain matters. But I want to read quotes from both of your reports to sort of really get what I'm talking about. First from Zack. It's incredible how easy it is to hide a large group of people camped in a very small wood. Right? Now, these are things we don't think about. But, very valuable insight. And now, Liam, the next day consisted of trying to locate the enemy. Whilst in the grand scheme of things, the area is quite small, around 6 square kilometers, on the ground, it feels rather large. And we did a lot of marching and counter-marching. At one point, myself and a couple of the fitter members of the National Guard, who presumably you were wondering if they were going to stab you in the back, carried out extra reconnaissance on foot, during which we could hear the French, but due to the terrain, could not see them. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the terrain in general, but this also very much reminds me of something that I always tell my students, which is how much cooperation it actually requires on both sides to have a battle. So speak to me about terrain and soldiering in the period and what you observed on this event.
Yeah, well, it's a great point, isn't it? And I mean, we don't have there's no such thing as aerial technology. I mean, you've got balloons and stuff, but there's no drones going up. There's no I-star in the sort of modern sense. So reconnaissance is done with the eyeball and maybe some optics. Some sort of telescopic optics if you have them, or if you have an officer who has them. And when you've got terrain like you do around Laboisiere Ecole, it goes from very open, sort of quite undulating farmland to really dense woodblock. And these woodblocks will be based around quite rocky and quite large, craggy features. So, you'll be on a track surrounded by open fields. You'll go up a slight slope into a woodblock, and all of a sudden you're in almost a sunken road going up a decent slope, and you're surrounded by not only by trees, thick ground cover, thick cover above, but also huge like boulders and rocks and stuff like that. And you might only be 300 meters away from either an ally or indeed an enemy, and you would have no idea that they're there. Now, like that example that I gave you in the notes, we'd gone up to the top of a central sort of ridge in amongst one of these really dense wood blocks, and looking at a map that Captain Middleton, that Zack mentioned earlier, that had showed me before he sort of sent me and these guys out. I knew roughly from his report and from the cavalry reports that the French were over to our sort of northwest-ish, and I could hear them. I could hear them moving in a wood block, and I could hear them talking, and like the occasional burst of laughter and stuff like that. But because of the ground and because of how dense this vegetation was, there was no way I'd be able to see them. Now, they were probably only, maybe 150, 200 meters away, which in the grand scheme of things isn't far. But also think about our ballistic capability at 150 or 200 meters. Now, with modern weaponry, that's nothing. It's almost as short as range as you can be. With the firelocks we have, I mean, that's extreme in the extreme, and clearly you're not going to start opening fire in a wood block that you can't see anything anyway. And it's just interesting to then report back, and you think, right, well, how are we going to find these guys? And also, which direction are they going? Well, I don't know, because I can't see them. Are they moving? I think so, yes. Well, but are they moving in a static location, i.e. building a bivouac or a defensive position, or are they moving through a position? It's so difficult to tell, and it really gets your sort of Napoleonic tactical mind thinking about how not only soldiers of the period, commanders of the period would process this kind of information. And you said at the beginning there, and I think Zack's sort of memory stint, sort of Zack almost had that strategic view, seeing it from all sides. Yes, he's on the ground, and I know you had Scoville as well, Zack. But for the sort of the soldiers on the ground, I'm playing the role of a corporal, and I've got two private soldiers with me looking for a French position. I've got no idea, really. And you've got no means of doing it other than, well, we'll just press on until we bump into them, at which point it's probably too late. So, passing that back to command and control, it really emphasizes not only how difficult that is during the period, but how good a job sort of staff officers and general staff did at finding the enemy. And then, like you say, both sides having that appetite to then that effort, that sort of, right, we are going to have a fight now. It's almost organized. It's like, I'll meet you behind the bike shed at 3:00 type stuff. It's crazy that this kind of, this feeling is, you're able to get this feeling in a modern way. I just don't think you could get anywhere else.
I can't offer anything like the level of insight that Liam says. Yes, I do have a sort of a different sense, because I let both sides sort of wash past me at various points very deliberately, so that you can kind of be tucked behind a tree in the center of the combat and see that kinetic movement. And also, you need to spend time with the French just as you do with the Allies. I think one of the things that particularly struck me was that it felt like the French always kept together. Captain Middleton's plan was very much sort of, let's go out, let's search, and then let's see. Almost a kind of a Corps-esque style of waging a campaign, sort of thing we would attribute to Napoleon. Whereas the French way of doing things seemed to be very tight. There always seemed to be plenty of reserves. They always seemed to have the weight of numbers. There was always another platoon that could come out onto a wing. They also had the advantage of cavalry, which you just cannot overstate. Even in a scenario as small as this was, you've got maybe 150 guys total across the two sides. Liam will probably have a better sense of numbers than I do, but 4 cavalry versus 2 cavalry, like that does genuinely make a big difference. To speak to the actual terrain, though, I think the real thing that struck me was you can't anticipate what's coming. As Liam says, from one minute you'll be in a bunch of fields kind of on this sort of little track, and then the next thing you know, you're in fairly open, quite sparsely wooded areas where the undergrowth is clear, and if you need to flush the wood, you can do. And then 20 minutes later, actually suddenly that's given way to really thick undergrowth that you can't push your way through. And so, inevitably an idiot like me with a tripod sort of trying to get stable shots of things ends up having a bit of a mare. It's an unrelenting challenge is the thing that really struck me. And trying to get through this landscape at pace, bearing in mind that my role is so much easier. I'm not carrying anything like the weight that these guys are carrying. I've got modern boots and all the rest of it. Actually getting through this terrain is quite a challenge in itself, and doing that in period kit whilst under fire, once you sort of look at what that looks like in reality, I think the respect for these guys certainly deepens somewhat.
I just want to add as well on that sort of terrain front, and it's something that you read quite often. The battle was fought on ground of his choosing. You sort of pay lip service to it, but I think when you actually do it in a scenario such as Laboisiere Ecole, that tiny wee sentence takes on such an important role. They talk about Waterloo being fought on ground of Wellington's choosing and all that sort of stuff. It just becomes, well, it has to be, otherwise it doesn't work. And that's for both sides.
Without question, right? It hammers home the importance of this very, very much. Also, Zach, your mention of sort of like you as the numpty with the tripod. I think in a way we are a Napoleonic Wars podcast, but spare a thought for 100 years later, and you have men trying to do this with machine guns and machine gun tripods. Getting a Vickers gun through that kind of terrain is no joke, or a Bren gun in the Second World War. All right, a little bit again on the technical side, but the sort of the technical side of the event, not of sort of the reenactment. Liam, your report mentions the rule set. Now, obviously, there has to be organization, as you say, there has to be health and safety. Tell us about this rule set, and is it negotiated for each event, or is it somewhat standardized?
Yeah, so it seems to be standard. I mean, I've done 2 of these sort of LBE events now, run by a sort of parent organization, and the rule set is there to try and create balance. So it does, I suppose, in some ways take away some of the realism, but things like if you are being charged by a bayonet and you yourself don't have bayonets fixed, you must give ground. So it sort of creates the scenario, because ultimately, I suppose at the end of the day, no one's actually going down for real. No one is dying. No one is taking real casualties or real wounds. If infantry retreat into a woodblock, then the cavalry can't follow them in. It's sort of it's to create balance, and also to allow commanders a tactical situation within the tactical situation, right? Like if we see cavalry, we can retreat to the woods, and we know that exercise play, we can survive that situation and such like that. I think the rule set in itself is really good. It sort of lends itself perfectly to the terrain at hand, because like we've said, it's different in many ways. And I think it's a really important thing to have, that it's given out to all sides. Everyone's aware of that situation. There's rules, there's sort of rules about, if you're taking prisoner, how you are taking prisoner, how to take prisoners, how long to take prisoners for, etc. Again, it just helps to keep the realism going without just, because it's a really difficult sort of position to be in, because if you're it's day one, you've just got there, you're super excited to take part in a skirmish, and then all of a sudden, you're a casualty, you're dead. Well, I've just traveled from England. I've paid lots of money to be here. People want to have a turn. So there's a way of like recycling troops and stuff like that. I've not seen other rule sets for other events. It's not something that really happens in the UK. The sort of other events I've taken part in are much more choreographed, where there'll be kind of a general scenario. There'll be a sort of end state that both commanders are aware of, and there'll be a bit of tune and fro in the middle. Waterloo is a great example of that. The reenactment that happened last year was quite a big one. But there's a general rule set, and not a rule set. There's a general choreographed flow. More so, I guess, than anything to make it entertaining. There's nearly 10,000 people watching. You want to make it a spectacle, and you want to make it engaging. So if everyone's just stood on opposite sides of the ridge watching each other with the occasional artillery piece firing, it's not gonna sort of butter any parsnips in terms of getting people's juices flowing towards the Napoleonics as an exciting spectacle. So yeah, in terms of the sort of public engagement factor, that's one thing. And I think, but for the sort of campaign tactical events, it's really important to have those rule sets. One thing I think I would like to see in future, and Mark and I have spoken about this, is perhaps some kind of umpire or marshal, someone who's perhaps in kit but detached from the scenario in a certain way, so they can kind of, we know what the French are doing. Like, you guys would be getting murdered right now, and I think it would perhaps help the flow. And I know other historical periods do that with these sort of campaign tactical events. It's always an evolving thing, right? Like, you carry out an exercise and you feedback, and you want to keep it cyclical, and you want to keep coming back. You want people to keep coming back, and you want more people to engage with this. Certainly for me, Zack and I have spoken offline about how I'm probably the extreme kind of right in terms of, like, I want to live this period. I want to feel what these soldiers felt. Whereas, the majority of folks are probably somewhere in the middle between, like, I'd like to set up camp, do some display type stuff, do some skirmishing, and then kind of go home to a nice warm bed. But in order to keep these events alive, you need to keep people coming back. And having those kind of rule sets and having that sort of flow, I think, just adds a little bit of structure. And like you said, Luke, that little bit of element of health and safety and stuff, which is all important, because no one wants to, ultimately it's a hobby. You don't want to go away for your weekend hobby. It's probably slightly different to playing golf or something, but you want to get home safe,
Probably more expensive than playing golf, which is a rare statement. I will let Zack in on this, but I just want to make a couple of notes on this. First of all, it sounds like you need an American as the marshal. Potentially, if you want to really, really go sort of theme, a member of the Swiss Guard. Sort of keep the neutral Switzerland thing going on here. This is actually another question that I was going to ask, but Liam mentioned it, so I'm going to roll them two together, and then I'm going to ask Zack for his opinion on both of these. Your account mentions, and I quote, this is a direct quote, "The affair was sharp but not long. We drove them out after a brisk fire and carried the bridge with the bayonet. We had several killed and wounded in the business, which was a heavy loss to so small a party. One man had been with the regiment since our time in Portugal." Now, minus the fearful lottery of war, the actual fearful lottery of war, how does a regiment such as the 44th decide who lives and who dies in a moment? In hand-to-hand combat, it's one thing, right? A guy comes at you with a bayonet, you're done. But for musketry, you're not firing paintballs. These outfits are way too valuable to mar with paint. So how do you decide this stuff?
So generally, it's first of all, it's down to weight of fire. So you know what, if we're not receiving fire, then clearly we're not going to take casualties. And generally, it's down to an individual who perhaps is either out of ammunition, or if we're all low on ammunition, who's the lowest. Or also, I think one of the other key things is if someone's firelock struggling, whether that be through, these things are quite temperamental, as Zack mentioned. If they're not getting a spark, or if they've tried to change a flint, and if it's for whatever reason it's just not firing, like, right, cool, go down, and you'll take a casualty. So that's how it's generally decided on the field. and with that kind of, with the more choreographed displays in mind, it's down to sort of local commanders, section commanders, platoon commanders. You know, if a French artillery piece fires, for example, like cool, the next time that the second gun from the left goes fires, you know, 3 or 4 you guys go down. So that's how it's generally decided in the moment.
Fascinating. I love the level of cooperation here. On the more choreographed events, and I think this is the real advantage. You know, when Zach and I were speaking about this, and we were, you know, just to pull the curtain back a little bit, we were talking about the title for this episode. And I had one title, and Zach said, no, you need the Battle of Laboisiere Ecole in there, otherwise no one's going to know what the hell you're talking about. And that's a very valid point, right? This is sort of a recreation. But it's a recreation of 3 weeks of an event a skirmish that could have happened in those 3 weeks. If someone goes to Waterloo or Austerlitz, or hell, on my side of the pond, Yorktown or Gettysburg, the people who go to these things know the history. If you go to Waterloo, you don't expect Napoleon to win unless you're Todd Campbell. You know, or you've only been to the gift shop, then you expect Napoleon to win. But if you know your history, you know how this is going to go. The freedom of something like LBE is that it can be down to the tactics. It can be down to what happens on the ground in a way that the names that we conjure, Austerlitz, Salamanca, Jena, Waterloo, Gettysburg, Yorktown, you can't do them, right? They are to a certain extent decided. Zach, I want to bring you in on your thoughts of these two questions. Now, obviously, you, despite the fact that you like to play God on this podcast, have no say at these events of who lives and who dies. But I would like your take on the rule set, how you thought it went, the organization, whether an impartial marshal, it's a good phrase, is a good idea, and also how you feel about the sort of the living and the dying and the advantages of an unknown event. No offense meant to LBE, but not an unknown outcome event like LBE.
Yeah, so in terms of the marshal, I think it would be great. One of the things that I scratched my head over was the points at which people should or should not have broken in the face of a bayonet charge, especially if there's been, we've talked in the past about sort of volume fire mentality. There are times when I sort of looked at a situation and went, hang on, why are those guys standing? Surely they should have given ground. And in a situation where it's not a real firefight and there is nothing at stake, there is perhaps a little bit more of a temptation to stand your ground and let the bayonet charge come to you. And I know Mark was very keen that the rule set might reflect that it was unusual for bayonet to meet bayonet. So I'm not entirely sure quite why certain actions ended up unfolding in the way that they did. Some, it was because guys had nowhere to go. So there was one point where the Dutch charged with the bayonet, and behind the French platoon, there's another guy who's kind of saying, no, it's okay, yeah, we've got some cars behind us, but you've got another 12 feet, you can fall back a little bit more, keep going. So there's a lot of very careful management of the safety, because A, nobody wants to damage civilian property, but also the safety of these guys has to be paramount the whole way through. So I think a marshal would be really good in terms of kind of saying, look, you guys now need to break, you're done, off you go, so that you can kind of maintain that kinetic element. Because ultimately, if two sides meet with the bayonet, and you know, you've got this great moment of sort of people jeering and shouting "Vive l'Empereur" or whatever it might be, but okay, now what happens? Because the momentum's been lost, and that momentum should have been maintained in reality. So I think a marshal would be a great thing. In terms of the rule set more generally, and particularly people dying, as a cinematographer, inverted commas, giving myself yet another grandiose title that I'm not worthy of, it's great to see people go down, because you want that human element. Sure, you want to see the volley, but actually to have that little reminder that there's a consequence to that volley is a really nice point to be able to demonstrate on screen. So as somebody filming the event, it's great to see that. What I also want to emphasize is the level of care that's taken the whole way through. Firstly, from a safety perspective, Liam's mentioned the wagon. It's there for supply of water, but it's also a safety sort of, not blanket, but it's for the guys who are really flagging. If they need to, they can step out, They put their packs on the wagon, and the agreement is your pack goes on the wagon, you're done for the day. You don't then pick up your pack and your firelock and then go back into the line, because you don't. If you're going to do this, you do the whole thing. And if you can't do this, that's fine. We're going to look after you. We'll sort of remove some of those struggles for you, but there is a consequence to that. And so I think that's a really nice element, partly because it underscores the fact that care is at the heart of this. And there were guys who were really cut up about the fact that they'd done a few of these events and then they came to Laboisiere Ecole and they just couldn't. It was one step too far. And I know there's a guy at the Chasseurs Britannique who made a point of coming in and apologizing to Mark because he was genuinely so embarrassed that he'd wanted to give his all at this event and just wasn't quite able to. It was just that little bit too much, one event too many. And the guys take care of each other and the girls within that as well. There's a lot of sort of, are you all right? Have you got enough water? Liam particularly kind of checking on the guys under him, make sure that you've taken on fluids, all the rest of it. But there's also a lot of looking after the landscape as well. There's a lot of respect for the fact that if it's a ploughed field, it's a working farm, and you don't just go and tramp all over it and use it as a convenient shortcut. Instead, you follow the path. And Mark was very good again at making sure that those rules were adhered to. And you've got civilians who are there as kind of local advisors, kind of going, look, I don't want you guys in that field because I planted that 4 weeks ago and it's just about to sprout, kind of thing. I'm sure that's a technical agricultural term right there. So yeah, there's a lot that goes into the spectacle, but there's also a lot that goes into being respectful and careful. And I really, really like that about the event. And I think, as Liam said, it's fantastic. I think everybody should go to them. I would love to see more of them. I would love to see a UK one happen. Liam and I keep sort of having tentative conversations about whether or not that could happen, because we would absolutely look at trying to facilitate that. But I for all that Liam says, sure, he's at the inverted commas extreme end. I think everybody should attempt this once. Like, I understand that some people just want to, fundamentally dress up, stand around, look the part, have a chat with some members of the public, and have a couple of beers at the end of the day round a fire. I get that totally. But equally, the level of additional insight that you get from this is second to none. Historians should go to these events, grueling though they are to follow. We should all be doing what we can to get more involved in this kind of stuff and to support this kind of work, because it gives us so many more insights and such a deeper appreciation of the realities of what we talk about the whole time.
And I think fundamentally it also hammers home something that a lot of historians are, hopefully not of our generation, hopefully not of the ones that we talk to on this podcast, but that a lot of historians sort of look at this and sneer. Sort of they're not actual historians. They're not doing the research, and it's nonsense, right? There's specialties in all things. If you want to talk about punishment, you come to Zack. If you want to talk about memory, you come to me. But if you want to know what kit someone was wearing at an event or what the weight of that cloth was, I go to Liam, right? Because he knows this stuff. Gentlemen, thank you so much for this. It's been fascinating. I hope our listeners enjoy it. It's a little bit different from our standard thing, but hopefully they'll get a kick out of it. Any final thoughts or things you particularly want to mention that I haven't covered?
Yeah, if somebody wants to sponsor a UK event, contact us. Or actually, so that's a very flippant comment, but if there is interest amongst listeners to either attend a UK style event or to participate, more crucially, because if we're going to pull this off, we're interested in doing the logistics to make it happen, but we need to know that there will be enough boots on the ground to make it worth the time. Get in touch with us through whatever channel, whether it's email, natwarspod@gmail.com, whether it's through our socials. If you think you would be up for, let's say, a day and a half, just immersing yourself in all of this stuff, drop us an email and let's see what we can do to make more of these events, because I do passionately believe that there is a huge amount of benefit in terms of our individual learning, but also in terms of the conversations that we then go and have with the public. For all that we love Sharp, we do also forever emphasize on this show, it's a dramatization, it's a fictionalization. And actually, for the folks who have got into this period through Sharp to then go and either witness it, because civilian attendance is something that can potentially be facilitated, or more generally, for the guys who are reenactors to then get that knowledge, to then take to the public at the more typical, inverted commas, reenactment events would be such a valuable thing. So people, get in touch. Let's see what we can make happen here in the UK.
Excellent. I have to say, I am not a reenactor, but if an event like this happens in the UK, I'm there to observe. And if you need an impartial marshal with an American drawl, I will do my very best. This has been the Napoleonic Wars podcast. You know my guests today. They are Dr. Zack White and Corporal Liam Telfer. We've got some fantastic stuff coming up for you. We've got, actually, very fitting given our conversation today, we have an entire episode on drill coming out soon. We've got a whole bunch of debate episodes. You seem to like those. We're following up the sharp stuff with the bangy stuff, to use the technical terms. Who did the most to destroy France? We've got a couple of other things coming up, and of course, as you've seen on social media, there's some interview with two old guys that I'm not sure about. We'll get that up there at some point. And by old guys, I mean Zack and Liam, and two icons of the field in the form of Sean Bean and Bernard Cornwell. Is it Bernard or Bernard?
I say Bernard, but...
Okay, Bernard. Well, I hope he doesn't take offense at that. But that's it for today. Keep your eyes on, subscribe, like. We have YouTube now. We've got some great videos up, so do that as well. But thank you for listening, and as always, we will be back very soon.
This Christmas, support the show for free by subscribing so that you never miss an episode. And if you've got a question, post it in the comments section, and we'll get back to you. Don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, and Napoleonic nerd catch-ups on Patreon. The link is in the description. Shoutouts to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid-December 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillam, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, Wojciech Stefanovic, Simon Weathers, John, Zach Johnson, Matthew Turner, Rich Payne, Edward Gilhead, Vic Martindale, and Adam Coslin. The Admirals: John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Wilcombe, Clemens Beman, Steve Carter, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, Darla Vincent, Rob Painter, Simon T, Alex, JC Kaiser, and Graham Swidenbank. And in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell, Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell, Chosen Man Graham, the Yankee Eurogale Jarl Brian Silicate, First Lord of the Treasury Ryan Diamond, Portree Prince of Pukalani Bob Burnham, General Alexander Suvorov, Seth Hansen, and too Jacobin to crown himself, Dan Hazelwood. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, stay nerdy, and as always, thank you for listening.